As a specialist in neuropsychology and having worked with thousands of patients, including athletes who have suffered many different kinds of head injuries, it's no surprise that this fight went horribly wrong. The boxing legend Mike Tyson, a 58-year-old, fought a 27-year-old Jake Paul. And it did not look good for Tyson, not just because of the fight itself, but the risks he took by stepping into the ring. Let's take a look at the science behind what happened during the fight, what this could mean for Mike's future, and why Jake Paul is receiving so much backlash for even organizing a fight like this. So I'm going to be watching some training videos of Mike Tyson preparing to fight Jake Paul. Mike is in excellent shape, right? At any age, but especially at 58. But there is something to be said about being really, really physically strong, but still being neurologically maybe at risk or at greater risk for potential head injuries. So again, if you just were to look at them objectively and not know their age, you'd think, hey, they're both really in really good shape. I guess that's why this fight was so compelling to watch for millions. So, boxing in and of itself is quite a dangerous sport. I don't think that I am surprising anyone with that, and you don't have to have, you have to be a doctor to figure that out. So, what makes this so concerning though is kind of the age difference here, where we have Mike Tyson, who's almost 60, even though he's in great shape, fighting someone who's in his 20s in also pretty excellent shape. Now, boxing in and of itself, I feel like is probably one of the easiest ways to get head injuries. I mean, the goal of boxing is to give the opponent a brain injury, right? We are trying to completely get them to knock out. That in and of itself should be quite concerning for the average person that's watching this. But then when you combine that basic premise with, the fact that Mike Tyson is a bit older, it's just an even bigger cause for concern. And then, not to mention, the fact that Mike Tyson, with all of his decades of experience, even though he's gained a lot of experience in all the matches that he's had, we're dealing with a brain that has probably been injured exponentially more, potentially, than Jake as well. So, that might be another concern, is all the prior hits and concussions that Mike Tyson had even before stepping into this ring. All right, so now we're taking a look at the actual fight, some highlights of it. This might look like little kind of minor hits, and yet, yes, they have gloves on, but they have no protective headgear, by the way, right? So all of these blows are landing. And one of these things that you have to remember is your brain, okay? Your brain is actually the consistency of warm butter. If you were just to leave some butter on your countertop, that's the actual consistency of your brain. So if you can imagine this glob of warm butter inside of a skull and then being hit and hit and hit, this brain is actually shaking inside of your hard skull, okay? And getting little bruises and contusions in so many different areas. So, it's painful for me as a neuropsychologist and as a doctor that specializes in brain injury to see people voluntarily do this to themselves. So let's keep watching a bit here. Okay, now in that one right there, we see that Jake Paul took a hit from Mike right in this kind of right frontal region of his brain, right there. Okay, you can see it here. When you see his brain, his head kind of snap back a little bit, that's the brain kind of sloshing back and forth inside the skull. This is something that we call contra coup injury. So you may have an initial hit right here at the front of the head, and then the brain will, with physics, kind of slosh back and forth. So not only is there the initial injury, the coup, but then you also have a contra coup injury as the brain kind of goes back and forth. So now we're dealing with, I can't even count how many hits that Jake has taken to his head already. All right, so we are in round 3 of 8 here. At this point, both of them have had hits. Motor control is getting a little impaired. You probably noticed that, maybe punches aren't landing as solidly as maybe they did in the first round. But that stands to reason considering how many hits they both have gotten at this point. I mean, we see some hits where, you know, Mike is punching and not even getting close to Jake Paul. I wonder if some of this has to do with some visual and depth perception issues. You know, I'm not sure. Like I said, some of the punches aren't landing as consistently. Oh my gosh. So that one right there that we just saw, okay, 2 in a row that we just saw with Mike taking 2 hits to the left side of his head here. And what's really interesting is that when you are hit and there's a rotational kind of a force, when we see rotational injuries with these concussions, sometimes those can be even more damaging, because if you can see here, you know, think about this where we have your spinal cord connecting to your brain stem, and this area, okay, of your brain stays somewhat kind of static there. Now, when there is movement and rotational injury like that, what you can have, maybe it's easier if I show it to you like this, is some movement and some twisting here around this brain stem, the subcortical region, where these areas are trying to be a bit more static and these areas are kind of stretching around it. So we can often get diffuse axonal injury, or DAI, really centered around those subcortical regions. And, you know, those types of injuries don't always really show up on regular imaging. Sometimes you have to do specialized type of neuroimaging in order to see some of that diffuse axonal injury. But those types of tearing and shearing with the axons can actually cause quite a bit of damage and some long-term issues. Oh man, that right side of Mike Tyson's head is really getting pummeled there. Again, just punch after punch to the right side here of Mike Tyson's head. You know, the right side can control, oh wow, okay. So again, you know, Mike is really getting pummeled on the right side of his head here. And as I told you before, we have, you know, the coup and then the contra coup injury. And so, you know, we're dealing with kind of the right frontal part of his brain here. And that frontal lobe controls things like, you know, impulsivity, planning, decision-making, weighing out pros and cons, being able to make good decisions, being able to really kind of regulate your emotions as well. I don't know if any of you have heard of something called pugilism, but pugilism is like a brain injury that boxers get because of all the hits to their head. You know, and unfortunately, a lot of these boxers and football players as well, and other elite athletes, after repeated head injuries, can have a lot of emotional dysregulation, a lot of increased risk of suicide, alcoholism, addiction, you know, and a history of poor decision making that could potentially stem from the changes in the brain due to numerous hits to the head. And of course, I don't know if there's any part of his brain or their brains that were kind of spared during this injury, during this fight. And so, you know, I would be very, very concerned about their emotional well-being, their physical well-being, not to mention their cervical spine. All those hits to the head happen on a neck that is honestly, biologically, kind of small compared to the bowling ball of a head that we have on top of this. And so I'm sure that there's going to be some neck pain and some neck strain if I were to do an MRI of their neck. So, wow, that was actually hard to watch again. But I hope that from a doctor's perspective, you know, you can see that boxing, although some think it's fun to watch, can be really, really hard for healthcare providers, especially for people like us or me that specialize in traumatic brain injury. One cannot think of boxing without thinking about one of the greatest, and that's Muhammad Ali. Now, many of you may have remembered, though, that after 61 fights, Muhammad Ali retired, and 3 years later was actually diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. At the time, in the 80s, I think that there wasn't enough understanding and research about how pugilism or these, you know, repeated head traumas could actually be linked to Parkinson's. And in fact, there's been some debate on whether it was or not. Now in 2024, there is an undoubtable link between repeated head trauma and an increased risk of Parkinson's, as well as other types of dementia. You know, and so that really begs the question for someone like Mike and even someone like Jake Paul, is that, you know, with all of these head traumas, and it was estimated that Muhammad Ali probably took hundreds of hits to the head over his career. But, it just begs the question that, is Mike Tyson now at higher risk for developing certain types of dementia? Is Jake Paul at higher risk for developing certain types of dementia? And I would absolutely say yes. Now let's talk about the aging brain and why that might have maybe some different consequences for Mike versus Jake. So, first of all, let's talk about how the brain ages and how it changes as it ages. And first of all, this might be shocking to many of you, but actually from around the age of 30 to 40, our brains start to shrink. They start to change. Jake is kind of in the prime of his neural development. So about around his age is when the brain is just pruning and finishing out its development, and it's just kind of at the height of its neuroplasticity and its neurogeneration. So that's where Jake Paul is. Now, Mike Tyson at 58, unfortunately, is where most of us are, where we're dealing with a brain that is changing and actually shrinking over time, okay? So as the brain also ages, processing becomes slower. So something to consider is that myelin, which is a white matter fatty sheath that actually covers the axons and helps information pass very quickly from neuron to neuron, starts to slow down. It starts to kind of slow down our cognitive process. Okay, so we have a brain that's starting to shrink, myelin that starts to decrease. The connections or synapses in our brain as we age also starts to decrease. And so we have fewer synaptic neuronal transmission. Next, inflammation can increase in the brain as we age, and then also blood flow may also start to decrease as we age. And so there are just some age-related factors that set Mike up for maybe a longer, harder recovery potentially from this versus Jake. Now, don't get me wrong, I think both of them have a ways to go with some of these concussions that they sustained, but I think just due to Mike's older age, he's probably going to be dealing with more factors that might limit or make his recovery a little harder. I often would get asked, why do people continue to make these choices? Why do people keep fighting? Why do people keep playing, sports or do MMA? I get asked this quite a bit. And the answer is really complicated. It could be due to this is what they love. This might be the only thing that they love, and this is their passion. If they're really good, it could be due to, financial issues. What if this is the best way that they know how to make this kind of money, right? This could be, something or a way that they can prove something to themselves or prove something to the world. There's a lot of different reasons. But whatever those reasons are, what is really hard for a healthcare provider like myself, especially one that focuses on traumatic brain injury, is that these reasons that they have at some point may not add up or match up with the long-term consequences that they may be setting up for themselves in the future. Overall, I know that no one lost consciousness, we didn't have like a total knockout, but it was still pretty harmful. I just want to point out that looking at this, it just still is hard for me to watch because I know that they're going to be dealing with long-term issues if Mike wasn't already dealing with long-term issues. But these could affect things like mood, emotion, decision-making, slurred speech, word-finding issues. Family members or loved ones might notice changes in personality and just kind of changes in how they deal with overstimulation and so on and so forth. And so I really hope that these athletes get the help they need after a fight like this and that they have the right people to support them. If you liked this kind of content, if you enjoyed my reaction as well as my input, please like and subscribe. And I would love to hear your own comments about the fight and what you thought about the information that we provided. Please, let us know if there's anything else that you would like me to see or comment on. And just as a final thought, I know that this is entertainment. I know how many millions of people love this sport, but just be so aware that even though this is for fun, these are real people and these are real lives, and We just have to really raise awareness about some of the devastating effects of traumatic brain injury. Thanks.